I'm going to be discussing the intersectionality of marginalization, the roots of discrimination for all marginalized groups residing in the oppression of Black people, and how this basis demands the interconnectedness of marginalized groups that have historically been turned against one another. Hello, I am Sterling of the Kairos System, and you're listening to my podcast segment on the Kairos Collaborative. We have dissociative identity disorder, and this YouTube channel is a project we developed to increase our own inter-system communication, connect farther with our DID community, and share our story and experiences. I chose to cover this topic for several reasons. The first being what I understand to be a lack of understanding behind what intersectionality means and the issues that some have with speaking over POC on a basis of supposed intersectionality. I also felt a need to cover this on account of the DID community's history with racism and lack of inclusion. We as a community, and even our system in particular, have ignored this topic due to a position of privilege. For many, this is not something that can simply be ignored. It's a living experience, and we as a community need to actively acknowledge racism that exists in the world and within ourselves and in our own community if we're ever going to make an inclusive safe space for POC systems. It brings me also into my next point in that I wanted to speak on this in particular due to a reluctance that I naturally had to make a dedicated video on such a touchy subject that is so misunderstood, speaking from the position of a non-Black, especially white body. And I felt that my understanding of this issue might not be as great as some other more familiar understandings of Black systems, of POC systems. However, I felt that this is a discussion and this is an issue that we can only begin to dismantle and begin to truly understand when those that hold up and those that created systems of oppression, that being white or so-called white individuals, are fighting to break that down. So until you have people in positions of privilege actively working to be anti-racist and to break down racism as it exists in our society, then there isn't going to be any real change. We cannot leave it to the oppressed to dismantle the systems we created. And the final reason I wanted to discuss this being the blatant historical intent that has been taken, especially by the American government, in hopes of turning marginalized groups against each other, leading to racism within many groups and more oppression in communities towards people of color. So in a definition, intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. And while my podcast will not focus on this issue in particular, intersectionality is most certainly not to say that an individual cannot, say, be Black and possess a number of other marginalized identities. In fact, discrimination is often intensified when you consider the intra-community social conflicts and systems of racism that exist even within other marginalized groups, which we'll discuss more later. In fact, the importance of this can be seen in a video that I was recently watching by Kat Black, and I'd like to highlight one thing I learned from her video regarding intersectionality and the lack of awareness that a lot of people have towards how these issues overlap. So she brought up multiple court cases in discussing this issue, and I very much recommend you go check her video out, which will be linked in the description. But the exact court case that I would like to point out is the graph in red versus General Motors, in which 5 black women sued General Motors for discrimination against black women in particular, and they lost because there was no significant evidence of discrimination towards either women or black people. Of course, all the women employed at General Motors at the time were white women, and all of the black people employed were men. And essentially they said that black women are not a protected group, despite the fact that black women experience racism and sexism differently than their more highlighted counterparts. What this means is that fights for equality and fights for a eradication of these discriminations are going to be told from the perspective of the privileged class when considering that particular discriminated group. Once again, this podcast isn't going to be talking much on that issue, but I definitely recommend checking out Cat Black's video, which again will be linked below. So what's the issue with this idea of intersectionality? The issue is that many people who fall into other discriminated groups or are disadvantaged in other ways other than their white privilege use their disadvantages as a means of speaking over POC experiences and speaking over black experiences. So some take the intersectionality of marginalization and discrimination as an excuse to over-empathize. Intersectionality does not mean that we can all relate to and understand the unique way in which black people have been oppressed in America. It would be more accurate to view intersectionality on 2 main principles. The first being that marginalized groups are oppressed by the same system, and the separation of these groups is an intentional act by said system to prevent a unified effort against oppression as a whole. The second principle being that dehumanization and effectively discrimination as we know it was greatly exacerbated by principles of slavery, meaning we cannot effectively eliminate any discrimination, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, what have you, until we eradicate racism. At this point, I thought I would share a poem that I feel encompasses this particular part of the issue especially well, and issues of a lack of interconnectivity amongst groups that experience intersectional discrimination. It's a well-known poem, you may have heard of it. The poem is First They Came. It is a poetic form of a post-World War II confession made in Germany by a German Lutheran pastor. First they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. This poem touches on why interconnectivity amongst oppressed groups is so significant to breaking down the systems of oppression. Because we are faced with the same oppressor, it is most essential that we unify and understand or attempt to understand the experiences of those that are being most severely oppressed by the system. And if it's not clear to you what I'm referring to when I say these systems, you have to consider that America's history as a global superpower is founded in the success of racial dehumanization. And not just America's history, but the history that countries have taken in and been inspired by the American system of imperialism. And that's not to say that systems of slavery, systems of racism, and systems of oppression and discrimination did not exist before America and before the colonization of the New World. But that discrimination on that level was not applied in a systematic way until the success of the economic empire that was America. The Europeans who fit the mold of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants that found success in colonizing and pillaging the entirety of what was the indigenous people's land, and in the process, while also, dehumanizing the entire indigenous population by saying that their lives are meaningless and we will take what is yours regardless of any principles of humanity that exist in our own homelands, but we want to come here to ignore. On top of that, we're also going to bring an entire group of people over and force them to build a nation while also viewing them as subhuman. This, I believe, is the foundation of dehumanization, the foundation of why we find it so easy to discriminate and to separate humans from their humanity, from their soul, so to speak. Whiteness was created, if Malcolm X wrote on, when he was visiting Mecca, Malcolm X spoke on the system of whiteness and on what whiteness means in America. And he said that in America, whiteness is and exists as an example of power, that those who identify as white and those who identify with what whiteness is do so because they believe that a separation from themselves, a separation from their humanity, gives them a glimpse at what those that actually do hold the power, that came here, that came to America in the colonial ages and stole and dehumanized and took economic advantage and were successful because America became the most economically flourishing superpower that existed at the time and that exists to this day. And other countries saw that and wanted to implement that. It popularized dehumanization to such a degree that while it hadn't existed in systems before, it was flourishing now, and it was flourishing as a way of you can step on whoever you want if it can get you to the top. And that is what America is founded on, not on freedom, as we so hypocritically like to say, because who is the freedom for? Who is the freedom of this country founded on? Where is the freedom in America? We say it's founded on freedom, it stands for freedom. Yet it is founded on the backs of Black Americans, and it continues to oppress Black Americans and indigenous people to this day. I truly don't see how any part of America represents the freedom that they so often like to boast of. It's a wonderful ideology and a wonderful attempt at what could have been a flourishing example of human rights and a flourishing example of a country which values its people above all else, but the fact of the matter is that it was corrupt from the beginning. It was corrupt from the foundation. And it was founded, regardless of what our beliefs and hopes and dreams were of what this country would become, it is founded and it continues to flourish on dehumanization. And that all roots back to slavery and the entire genocide of indigenous people in America. And that is why the normalization of this dehumanization that can be seen in the foundations of America, I believe, are also the foundations of the system of oppression that continue to impact minority groups to this day. I mean, as I said, we learn to separate humans from their souls on slave ships. That's where it originates. And yet you can still see so much racism in other minority groups that has been deliberately implemented by the American government. Look at any aspect of the Reagan or Nixon administration and you will blatantly see what I mean. Racism exists among other ethnic groups. It's extremely intensified in indigenous or Latino groups. And you can see this in aspects of especially the LGBTQ community, which we are a part of. The figurehead of the queer community is the, gay white male. That is who Americans are comfortable fighting for the rights of. When it comes to Black trans women or trans people in general, or anyone who falls outside of the gender binary, you get radio silence. You can see aspects of racism in feminism and in the feminist movement, where, of course, the direction of fighting for rights and the direction of what discrimination illustrates itself as is told from the perspective of the white woman and of the privileged class in that right. And in many movements, this isn't just to say that there's a problem with feminism. We do consider ourselves to be feminists, but there's an issue. There's an issue in the LGBTQ community with a representation of black voices despite being founded, again, on the backs of black people, on the backs of black trans women in particular. And yet we continue to underrepresent, to, appropriate the language and the mannerisms and the culture of black people without even giving them simple acknowledgement that their lives matter. That's just too much to ask, but we can, reap all the sow that we've been forcing them to create for our societies for, 400, 500 years now. But that's, not to be considered. And then you have the racism in the DID community, which I feel deserves a little bit of a farther extension on than some of the other topics I just mentioned, because we are a DID channel and that's the main focus of our videos and what we make. So there's been a particular issue, if you haven't heard, with white-bodied systems having alters that claim to be non-white. And the problem with this isn't that these alters present in a certain way or have affinity for a certain culture. No one is saying that, and that's not... It seems that that's the offense that many take, is we don't create how our alters look. If you're not aware, people with dissociative identity disorder have no say in how the alters turn out, or very little at all in anything about the alters, or about how alters in one system present. It's outside of our choice. But we most certainly do choose how we describe and the values we place, our priorities, so to speak, in our own community. What people are saying is that those in the DID community who may have alters that present in a certain way need to use appropriate language and take appropriate steps in not over speaking and speaking over and inserting themselves in communities which they cannot possibly understand as white-bodied systems. So white-bodied systems should not use language of saying, I have a black alter, I have an indigenous alter, what have you. The appropriate language would be, I have an alter that presents with a darker skin tone, or I have an alter with an affinity for a certain culture, or I am an alter with an affinity for some culture, or what have you. And of course, coming with that is the importance that one does not speak over experiences or insert themselves into communities which they do not belong. Because being black, being indigenous, is so much more than a skin tone, is so much more than the experiences, stereotypes, associations that one might vicariously have with the traumas that person experiences. We cannot possibly understand, no matter how close you may have been to anyone that belonged to those experiences or had those experiences or were in those communities, you cannot possibly understand with vicarious experiences what that was like. And that is such an essential part because of how our country has formed, of what it means to be a person of color in this country. So to claim that without understanding what that truly means contributes to the racism, contributes to the lack of safety that people of color have in our communities. And if you prioritize what you think is healthy or comfortable or what have you for your own system over the safety of people of color in this community, then you are part of the problem and you need to do some self-consideration. There's no reason that you can't simply change vocabulary and action in order to make others feel more safe. I mean, we as the DID community should understand why vocabulary is so important when it comes to language, who are you right now, as opposed to who's in front right now. Like, those things carry weight, and we need to extend that empathy to our POC brothers and sisters in our community so that we can ensure that they feel as though they have a place where they belong. Because right now we are not doing a very good job of that. I also, in talking about issues of racism and DID, wanted to talk about how mental health stigma exists in Black communities. And this kind of ties back to the beginning when I mentioned the single door access that discrimination has, and how intersectionality counteracts that, or attempts to, in some interpretations. So, in Black communities, not because of any genetic issue or biological association or whatever racists want to say, it's not anything to do necessarily with biology beyond generational trauma, perhaps, more so because of the social associations and what we allow Black people to safely present themselves as having. For example, presenting weakness as a Black person in America is opening yourself up to danger, is opening yourself up to further oppression. So when it comes to showing mental health issues, it becomes further stigmatized within the Black community because of associations forced by racism of the oppressor, forced by white America. These are systems that we are enabling within our own communities. So when you consider, the lack of focus in BIPOC communities on mental health, and then you consider how poorly certain communities represent those that are minorities in that discrimination, and how unique those minority experiences are for people with multiple accesses to discrimination. We're not creating open spaces. We're not allowing any place for Black systems to feel like they have a place to heal. We only represent white, traumatized survivors' experiences. So how are people supposed to feel like they have a place where they can be with others who understand? And I know for us that has been such a pillar of our healing, being heard and being understood. And you have Black systems speaking on their experiences, speaking on how the vocabulary white systems are using makes them feel, and they're being blatantly ignored, and they're being not just ignored but silenced and censored. That is so much part of the issue, and it connects to such a bigger system of intersectionality and of racism in America and in our communities, and it's something that we have to address, and that white systems have to be a part of addressing, that we can't just let Black systems continue to be silenced because they've been speaking out for so long and they have not been listened to. And on top of, I feel it's important to mention, on top of the issue of not being allowed to show weakness, you also have the lack of economic security, the lack of social acceptance that is forced by racist systems onto Black people, which contributes to racial trauma, which contributes to societal traumas. And so, that it's a cycle of inflicting further mental pain and having a lack of resources and a lack of community support to be able to heal from that trauma, and it all just continues to pile on. And despite this, proper services for mental health and for actually aiding people in a way that is beneficial to their communities are left on the wayside, and resources are stacked into over-policing underprivileged communities, which of course leads to more arrests, which leads to more criminalization and further rates of crime because of police brutality and because of how the system creates cycles that keep those that are underprivileged from ever being able to climb out. We do not all have the same opportunities in this society as much as the right wants you to believe. We don't have the ability to all become wealthy Americans. The American dream is a lie. The American dream only exists for wealthy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men. And that's just the fact of the matter. If you are anything else, you have to fight so much harder to be even recognized, let alone offered the same opportunities as your privileged counterpart. And foundations of racism are most certainly purposefully injected into these various minority groups to ensure division amongst the oppressed. Because if all that had ever been put down by the system rose up against those that contribute to the oppression, that represent the oppression, the wealthy, the elite, what have you, the white ruling class of supremacy, if we all stood up and tore that down, like, for example, systems of policing, we would be unstoppable. And that's precisely what they want to prevent. And they insert many distractions and lies and miscommunications to ensure that that happens through controlling media, through controlling politics. I'm not trying to get in a political side of this. I want to view this as a very human rights problem. Because me, myself, I am an anarchist, and there's an issue with my particular political affiliation, if you want to call it that, speaking over black voices in this movement. And I don't stand by that. I 100% believe in following the black movement and how we go about dismantling these systems of oppression. Because black liberation is at the foundation of this movement. It is at the foundation of these systems of oppression for every group that is experiencing oppression in this country. We cannot have freedom for any of us until we have black liberation. And the power behind unification is why media, which is why the government and why conservatives in particular are so afraid of the Black Lives Matter movement right now and are actively working to create public divide and silence public opinion and alienate the media opinion from that of the protest, to paint the protesters as though they are trying to create complete ruin in a system that has honestly been violating the social construct. And now that they're dismantling that contract that for them has been violated, we as America, we as white America, are acting like they are the problem, like they started it. Like we have been stepping on their toes for centuries. And you get a little bit back, and now, you're the victim. But by beginning to examine the systems of racism in our society, we're taking steps to empower the marginalized and take power from the oppressor. I'm not trying to move attention in all of this. I'm not trying to move attention from the main purpose behind this movement. The movement is black liberation. Dehumanization and oppression are founded on systems of racism, and we cannot liberate any of us until we have total black liberation. But the interconnectivity seen in groups that have had their autonomy ripped from them by this oppressive system, by this oppressive state, is the strength behind this movement. We were afraid to speak on this matter because we are a non-black system. But we cannot dismantle racism without the work of those that built these systems in the first place, namely those categorized as white and benefiting from societal white privilege. And it's extra important that those of us who do benefit from white privilege while belonging to other marginalized groups actively work to be anti-racist and work to dismantle the systems of racism that currently greatly influence our society. If the mere basis that Black Lives Matter isn't enough to spur your activism, realize that when they come for you, there will be no one left to speak out for you. And they will come. No lives are safe. No lives are free. No lives will matter to this oppressive system until Black Lives Matter. How we can't agree on that one statement as a society to this day is incomprehensible to me. And a little side note, if you're not anti-racist and you're LGBTQ, you don't deserve pride. The fact of the matter, it's that simple. So I think I want to draw this to a close by speaking directly to our community. We need to actively work to make our community spaces inclusive and safe for BIPOC systems, especially when so much of the world currently is very scary for many, especially amongst traumatized survivors. If this means a change in language, elevating their voices, or standing beside them at protests, that is what we need to do. I hope you have a great Juneteenth. Enjoy your celebrations. Donate below at some of the organizations to help support Black Lives Matter, and make sure that you're doing your part to actively dismantle the systems of racism that unfortunately continue to plague our society. Thank you for listening.